There is a moment, sometime in the late summer of 743 AD, when the world holds its breath. In a clearing in what we might today call northern Francia, a man walks a furrow behind a heavy-wheeled plow. The iron share cuts through soil that his grandfather broke and his grandfather before that. The ox ahead of him breathes invisible clouds. The field smells of turned earth and dung, and the distant smoke of a cooking fire where, somewhere behind the tree line, a small cluster of timber and thatch buildings exhales the morning. He does not know the year in the way we would number it. He knows the feast days, the frost, the migration of birds, and the particular weight of rye in his hand when it is ready. This is what agriculture looks like in the middle of the 8th century, not romantic, not medieval in the storybook sense, but embedded in soil and season, and the accumulated knowledge of generations who rebuilt farming almost from the ground up after the Roman world contracted away, like a tide going out. To understand what agriculture meant in 743 AD, you have to first understand what had been lost. The Roman Empire at its height had maintained a food system of staggering complexity. Grain moved by ship from North Africa to feed the city of Rome itself, a population that may have exceeded 1 million people. The irrigation channels, drainage works, terraced hillsides, specialized crop rotations, professional agronomy texts, state granaries, and organized trade networks meant that food, while never equally distributed, flowed across the Mediterranean world at a scale that would not be matched again for centuries. When the Western Roman administrative structure collapsed across the 5th and 6th centuries, that system did not simply pause and wait. It unraveled. The specialized estates that had fed urban populations broke into subsistence plots. The trade ships stopped running regular routes. The cities emptied. The knowledge written in agricultural manuals survived only in monasteries, if it survived at all. And the monks who preserved it were often copying texts whose practical application had already been lost in the communities around them. By 743 AD, Europe's population had almost certainly not recovered to late Roman levels. And estimates vary significantly, but scholars generally suggest that the population of Western Europe had contracted substantially following the plagues, famines, and dislocations of the post-Roman centuries, and that the Justinianic plague, which struck in waves from 541 AD onward, had reshaped mortality patterns across the continent. The people farming in the Frankish heartland in the mid-8th century were the descendants of survivors, and the agriculture they practiced bore the marks of that survival. It was conservative in the best sense. It did not experiment recklessly. It relied on what worked, what fed families through winter, what an ox could pull, what soil near a river would yield without exhausting itself in a generation. The open field system that characterized Frankish and later Carolingian agriculture was already consolidating by this period. Archaeological surveys of early medieval settlement patterns in northern France and the Rhineland reveal a shift toward nucleated villages surrounded by large communal field strips, a landscape that contrasts sharply with the isolated Roman villa estates that had preceded it. At sites across what is now Belgium and northern France, aerial photography and ground survey have revealed the ridge and furrow patterns left by centuries of heavy plow cultivation in ghost landscapes pressed into the earth by tools that no longer exist, wielded by hands that left no written record. Each family in a village like the ones excavated near Brébières in northern France would have held strips in multiple sections of the field system, a hedge against total loss if one section flooded or failed. A built-in form of agricultural risk management that required no formal institution to administer, only neighbors who understood the same unspoken rules. Afar, the plow itself tells an important story. The Romans had used the aratum, a simple scratch plow adequate for the light, dry soils of the Mediterranean basin. The heavier, wetter soils of northern Europe demanded something more powerful. And the Germanic and Frankish farmers of the early medieval period had developed and refined the karuka, the heavy-wheeled plow with a coulter to cut vertically and a mold board to turn the soil over rather than merely scratching through it. This technology fundamentally shaped the landscape. The heavy plow required teams of oxen, sometimes 4, sometimes 8 animals working in tandem, which meant that no single family could easily own and operate the equipment alone. The result was cooperative labor arrangements, neighbors pooling their animals for plowing season, an early form of collective agriculture driven not by ideology, but by the practical reality of what it took to break heavy soil. The karuka also worked best in the long strips that came to define the open field system, because turning a heavy plow team was slow and costly in effort. So you plowed as long a strip as possible before turning. The landscape of medieval Europe was shaped in part by the inconvenience of turning oxen. Crop selection in 743 AD reflected the same logic of reliable sufficiency over variety or volume. Spelt and emmer wheat had ancient roots in European agriculture. But by the 8th century, rye had become critically important in the cooler, wetter regions of the north. Rye tolerates poor soils and cold temperatures that would defeat wheat. And archaeobotanical analysis from early medieval settlement sites consistently shows high proportions of rye grains and chaff in the preserved plant remains. Barley was cultivated extensively, both for food and for ale, which was the safe, calorie-rich, mildly fermented beverage that people of all ages drank instead of water of uncertain safety, on oats fed animals and people alike. Legumes, particularly peas, beans and lentils, played a crucial role not only in diet but in soil health, fixing nitrogen in fields that would otherwise have been exhausted by grain monoculture. The 3-field rotation system, where one field grew winter grain, one grew spring grain or legumes, and one rested fallow, was becoming established across Frankish agricultural zones by the Carolingian period, and some scholars believe it was already practiced in variant forms in the mid-8th century, though its formal articulation comes later in documents like the Capitulare de Villis, the agricultural survey that Charlemagne would issue near the end of the century. The monastery was, in this period, both a center of preserved agricultural knowledge and an active farming enterprise of considerable scale. The Benedictine monasteries, operating under the rule of Saint Benedict, understood labor as a form of spiritual discipline. And the fields worked by monks and their lay dependents were often among the most productive in their regions. Monastic houses maintained orchards, fish ponds, herb gardens, and dedicated kitchen gardens that preserved cultivars and techniques that might otherwise have vanished from the surrounding landscape. The herb garden of a monastery in 743 AD would have included plants grown for flavoring, for medicine, and for practical uses like dyeing cloth or repelling insects. The Hortulus, written a little later by Walafrid Strabo, a monk at Reichenau, gives us a rare glimpse of what a Carolingian monastic garden looked like. The raised beds, the familiar herbs like sage and rue and lily, the careful attention to drainage and soil condition. These gardens were living libraries, places where botanical knowledge was kept alive in root and leaf when it could not be maintained in text. Domesticated animals wove through every aspect of daily agricultural life in this period, and the relationship between early medieval farmers and their livestock was far more intimate and economically central than modern industrial farming allows us to easily imagine. The ox was the engine of the heavy plow, irreplaceable and expensive, fed through the winter on precious hay and straw, and housed in the longhouse beside the human occupants in some settlement types because the shared warmth was practical for both species. Zooarchaeological evidence from early medieval sites across northern Europe shows that cattle were not slaughtered young for maximum meat yield, but were kept alive into old age. worked until they could no longer work, and only then butchered. The meat of an elderly ox is not prime dining, but the decision made complete economic sense in a world where the animal's living labor was worth more than its dead flesh. Sheep provided wool for the textiles that clothed the community, milk, and eventually meat. Pigs were efficient converters of forest mast and kitchen waste into stored fat and protein, and drove out into the oak and beech forests in autumn to fatten on fallen acorns. A practice called pannage that is documented repeatedly in medieval sources and visible in the landscape place names that survive across England and France. Chickens and geese populated the settlement yard, laying eggs through the seasons, providing feathers for pillows and writing quills, and ending their days in the pot. The horse presents a more complicated picture in 743 AD. The heavy horse collar that would eventually make horses practical for agricultural plowing had not yet fully replaced the throat and girth harness that put pressure on the animal's windpipe, limiting its pulling power. Horses in this period were primarily used for riding and light transport rather than field labor, and remained associated with warriors and elites rather than peasant farmers. The slow adoption of the padded collar, along with horseshoe technology that protected hooves on hard surfaces, would eventually transform the horse into a farming animal. But in the mid-8th century, the ox still held the field, slower but stronger and cheaper to maintain. Wild food supplemented cultivated crops in ways that are easy to underestimate. Early medieval communities lived at the edge of vast forests that covered much of interior Europe. And those forests were not empty wilderness, but managed resources. Deer, boar, hare, and wild birds supplemented protein in seasons when domestic animals were too valuable to slaughter. Mushrooms, berries, nuts, and wild plants moved through the diet according to season, and the knowledge of where to find them, when they fruited, and how to prepare them safely was a form of ecological literacy passed down through households. Fishing was crucial wherever rivers and lakes were accessible, and fish bones recovered from early medieval settlement deposits reveal a dietary reliance on freshwater species that supplemented grain and meat through the long weeks of Christian fasting when meat was forbidden. The interplay between the cultivated fields, the managed forest, and the waterways created what some archaeologists have described as a total food landscape, a relationship with the natural environment that required detailed knowledge across multiple ecosystems to sustain a community through a full year. Death was always close in the agricultural cycle of 743 AD. A late frost in April could destroy the young grain. A wet summer could produce ergot in the rye, the toxic fungal growth that caused the convulsions and hallucinations and gangrene that medieval people attributed to St. Anthony's fire. A dry summer could shrink the harvest below the minimum required to feed the village and still set aside seed for the next year. The margin between sufficiency and famine was measured not in months, but in weeks. And the community's relationship to this precariousness shaped everything from religious practice to the social obligations that governed who helped whom when the grain ran short. Carolingian legal codes from this period attempt to regulate grain hoarding and price gouging during famine conditions, which tells us something both about how common those crises were and about the emerging capacity of political authority to respond to them. The agricultural landscape of 743 AD was not a failure. It was a reconstruction, imperfect and fragile, in ways the people living within it understood better than we can. But also a living system that fed communities, sustained animals, some preserved botanical knowledge in monastic gardens, and laid the physical groundwork for the population recovery and economic expansion that would begin to accelerate in the centuries following. The ridge and furrow still pressed into English fields, visible from the air on a clear autumn morning, and the open field system still discernible in the structure of some European villages, are not relics of backwardness. They are evidence of a civilization working out, strip by strip and season by season, how to feed itself from the soil of a post-Roman world that had largely forgotten what Roman agriculture had achieved and had to find its own way forward. When you stand at the edge of a reconstructed early medieval field at a living history site, or look down from a plane window at the ghostly corrugations of a medieval field system preserved beneath modern grass, you are looking at the result of decisions made by people who had almost nothing except their knowledge of seed and soil and ox and sky. They did not know they were building the foundation of medieval Europe. They were trying to get through the winter. That is the remarkable thing, not that they failed to match Rome, but that from subsistence and improvisation and the slow accumulation of practical wisdom, they built something that endured.